History's strange, it's alien, and it won't give us what we would like to have.
It's hour 3 of a Tuesday morning, the 14th of July, 2026. Glad you're along for Bill Mick Live this hour, which brought to you by O'Galley Electric. And hour 3 of a Tuesday for a number of years has been Dave Does History. Over the last year, it was Liberty 250. That concluded with the 4th of July weekend and our Florida Roundtable shows, the last week of June, the first week of July. And now we move on from the Liberty 250 to other things in the country. Dave's titled this one, Bastille Day, Another American Revolution. Dave, tell me what we're talking about here, sir.
Well, every July 14th, Bastille Day, it is seen in France as their version, I guess, of Independence Day in a lot of ways. If you turn on the news today, you might see some of the celebrations in Paris, the flyovers of the Arc de Triomphe, that sort of thing. And it is seen as the legitimate French Revolution, the beginning of the French Revolution. Now, we have the advantage of historical hindsight, of course, and we will know that the French Revolution does not technically succeed, at least not in the establishment of a French republic a la the American Republic. But it is still celebrated as that national holiday. Children learn about it. Politicians will make speeches about it. It's become the universal symbol in France of people rising against oppression. But as we will learn, history is never that simple.
And we find out in 60 seconds here on WMMB. You know, Dave, when I have recollection of learning about Bastille Day as a kid, stormed prison, Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake, and somewhere the Red Queen yells off with her head. Now, maybe I mixed a few things in there, but that's my recollection. Tell me, what are we talking about?
The storming of the Bastille is, well, it's one of those things in history that everybody knows about, but nobody actually outside of France really knows about.
Yeah.
To understand why the Parisians marched on the Bastille, you have to begin years before that. France had gone bankrupt. The nation of France was absolutely bankrupt. And that might surprise you because France, of course, is one of Europe's great powers. They have a magnificent army, a prestigious monarchy, the glittering palace at Versailles. And on the surface, everything looks impressive. But behind the scenes, their treasury, their economy was absolutely collapsing. The French monarchy had spent years fighting very expensive wars, including, by the way, the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
They spent a lot of money. They went way into debt on the American Revolution, primarily to get revenge on Britain. And there you go. Well, but French soldiers fought alongside Washington. French fleets helped win the battle at Yorktown. And, of course, Lafayette was a big part of this. All of those French loans to America helped make America's independence possible, which makes the irony pretty much impossible for Americans to ignore. France had helped create the United States while digging itself into a financial hole so deep that it threatened the survival of the French government itself. By the late 1780s, the interest payments alone, by some estimates, were almost 90% of the revenues that they were bringing in.
Mm.
Then they had a bad series of harvests. Bread prices were through the roofs. The people were upset. When we hear that today, it doesn't sound catastrophic. Bread is just one item on the grocery list. But for 18th century France, bread was the grocery list for most of the working families. Bread would account for most of the household budget. If that price doubled, families, they didn't buy less. They went hungry. Imagine spending everything you earned just to buy enough food to survive and then watching the price of that double while wages stayed exactly where they were. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was desperation. And so by 1789, France was facing the perfect storm. The government was broke. The people were hungry. And people were losing confidence in the monarchy. King Louis XVI had one constitutional option left. He summoned the Estates Générales, which was an assembly of the French leadership that had not met since 1614. They were supposed to solve the crisis. Like most governments, though, they managed to make things worse. French society is divided into three what are known as estates. The first estate was the clergy, the church. The second estate was the nobility. And the third estate was everybody else, which sounds balanced until you realize that the third estate makes up 98% of the population. So they should have 98% of the representation, right? No. But they only got, their votes were automatically overridden, basically, in the Estates Générales. The deadlock would come, arguments would start, and finally, the representatives of the third estate, the common people, declared that they, not the king, represented the nation itself, and they proclaimed themselves as a national assembly. Now, King Louis had an option here. He could have taken direct action, but he hesitated. Sometimes he looked like he was willing to compromise. Other times he seemed determined to restore order by force. Mixed signals are a very dangerous thing during a political crisis because when you get mixed signals, you just assume the worst. Two decisions convinced many Parisians that a military crackdown was imminent. First, thousands of French troops, royal troops, began circling Paris. So King Louis brought in the army. Then Louis dismissed his finance minister, a guy by the name of Jacques Necker. And we're not going to get into all of this, but Necker was very popular because he had understood the financial crisis and he had the confidence of the people, and he was favoring reform. His dismissal was seen as a warning. People did not see it as just replacing one government official with another. They believed it was the opening move before the army marched into Paris and crushed the National Assembly. Fear was spreading faster than facts. Crowds began arming themselves. And on July 14th, thousands gathered at a hotel near the Bastille where they seized 30,000 muskets. Now, the problem was they had 30,000 rifles. They didn't have any gunpowder. Mm-hmm. But guess where the gunpowder is? It's in the Bastille. Now, the Bastille today is mostly paintings and imagination, but historically it was quite different. It was a medieval fortress, later serving as a state prison. By 1789, this state prison held 7 prisoners, 4 of whom were forgers, 2 of whom were mentally ill, and 1 was an aristocrat who had been imprisoned by his own family because of his scandalous behavior.
Okay.
You read into that whatever you want. There were no masses of political prisoners in the Bastille waiting to be liberated. No underground dungeons packed with forgotten victims. The Bastille mattered less because of who was inside than because of what it was represented. The massive stone walls symbolized the arbitrary authority of the monarchy. Does this sound familiar to us at all?
Yeah.
If the people believed that the king could imprison someone without a trial, then the Bastille was the physical embodiment of that absolute royal power. And symbols often matter more than practical realities, as we've learned. The governor of the Bastille, a guy by the name of Bernard-René de Launay, was trapped. He didn't know what to do. Commanded a very small garrison, didn't have enough men to resist, but he didn't want to surrender either. So he negotiated for hours, which of course led to more misunderstandings. Eventually shots were fired. To this day, nobody, much like Lexington, nobody knows who fired first. But once the shooting began, all the compromise went away. The crowd attacked, the cannons were brought forward, and after several hours of fighting, Delaunay recognized the resistance was hopeless. He surrendered. And if the story ended there, Bastille Day would simply commemorate a military victory, but of course, it's not where it ends. As Delaunay was being escorted away, the crowd turned on him. He was beaten, stabbed, and his head was cut off and placed on a pike carried throughout the streets of Paris. Other officials began meeting similar fates, their heads too becoming public trophies.
Wow.
This is the part of the French Revolution that often disappears from the inspirational paintings. It was not a peaceful constitutional reform. It begins with political violence. That fact does not erase genuine grievances, but it does kind of make us question some things. The methodology chosen to solve these problems matters just as much as the problems did themselves. And that's why the Bastille raises a fascinating historical question. What happened? Was this the birth of liberty? Was this a second American Revolution? Or was it the moment when political violence became accepted and a legitimate tool of governing? And it may be that the uncomfortable truth is that the answer is both. The fall of the Bastille will convince millions of French that ordinary people could overthrow even the oldest institutions of power. Americans are watching this from across the ocean. At first, we're kind of excited about this. Look, the French threw off their king too. Yay! Aren't they just following our example? Isn't this great? But the Bastille does more than launch the French Revolution. It begins a political argument in the United States, which will divide Americans into rival camps and shape our first political parties and force ourselves to answer a question we'd never faced before. How far should a revolutionary go before it becomes something else?
And we continue taking a look at Bastille Day, the impact on America, next.
Empires rise, empires fall, and somebody always writes it down, but not always legibly. Good thing you're here and Dave has somewhat decent penmanship. It's Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
Thanks, Victor Lyle. Dave Bowman is with us with Dave Does History. O'Galley Electric bringing you the hour. Dave, as you were opening up talking about Bastille Days, a couple of things hit me. You said fear travels faster than facts and that political violence was becoming legitimized. And it sounds like a lot of what we talked about in hour two with the state of Florida politics today.
My grandfather used to say all the time, there's nothing new under the sun. He picked that out of the Proverbs. But
sure,
the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I always laugh when people say, we've never been more divided. I mean, basically what you're saying to me is, tell me I know nothing about history without telling me you know nothing about history. So, yeah, we have. And this is one of those moments. The Bastille Day initially seems promising, and Americans are really behind this. I mean, after all, how could we not be? France had helped us win our independence. France, had supported us. And so when Frenchmen began to rise against a monarch, as we had done, we Americans tended to believe that we were watching our own revolution being reflected back at us. Thomas Jefferson certainly saw it that way. He was in France during the early stages of the crisis. He was actually consulted by Lafayette about some of the documentation that they were putting together for what would become the French rights of man and the citizen. Jefferson admired much of what they were trying to accomplish. To Thomas Jefferson, the French Revolution seemed like the natural expansion of Enlightenment liberty. America had proven that a people could reject a monarchy and build a republic. And in fact, not only had we built a republic, but then we had rebuilt the republic. The Constitution by this day in 1789 has got into effect. 11 states have ratified it. There's still 2 holdouts, North Carolina and Rhode Island. I'll cover that another day. George Washington is the president of the United States. So we had not just built the republic, we'd rebuilt it and made it work. And Jefferson was hoping that France could do the same again in Europe. And if he did, if France did, imagine the signal that sends to all those hundreds of little monarchies across Europe. Jefferson's not alone. Newspapers across America celebrate the fall of the Bastille. Public meetings are held to praise the courage of the French people. We toasted liberty in France as if it were our younger siblings' liberty. There was a sense that the old world was finally learning from the new one, and for a moment, at least, that connection seemed very obvious. America had declared that all men are created equal. France now declared the rights of man and the citizen. America had rejected hereditary power, common sense, France now challenged the aristocracy and its privilege. America had overthrown British authority, and France was now confronting royal absolutism. To Americans sympathetic to France, this was not foreign chaos. It was a familiar revolution, just wearing a different uniform. Problem is, of course, things were about to change.
So, Dave, things are about to change, and it's not exactly what the Americans thought it was.
I don't think it's what anybody thought it was. If the French Revolution had just stayed fixed at constitutional reform, as ours had, it probably succeeds. The problem, of course, is the French lost control of this thing, and they started to remake society as a whole. That almost didn't change at all in the United States. What changed was our government and our system. We didn't really change society. We didn't tell people how they had to live.
Right.
The violence of the Bastille had been shocking, but we explained it away as the excess of a desperate people. The old regime had been oppressive, hungry. Revolution was never really tidy, we said. But then came the October days, when thousands of Parisians marched to Versailles and forced the king and the queen back to the capital. And it's only Lafayette's interference in that actually doesn't result in the king and the queen, particularly the queen, Marie Antoinette, being murdered that day. But they were no longer under pressure. The royal family was now effectively captivated. Then came the attacks on the church, not simply as an institution needing reform, but as a rival source of moral authority. The civil constitution now placed the clergy and the Catholic Church under the control of the government. Priests were required to swear loyalty oaths to the new order. And if you didn't, you were now considered to be an enemy of the revolution. That matters to us because even though Americans tended to be suspicious of established churches, we had not gone that far. We never tried to nationalize conscience. But the French Revolution went further. They abolished titles. Well, so what? So did we in our Constitution. But then they changed the calendar. How many of you knew that the French redid the calendar during the French Revolution? And it's insane. You should go look it up. Political language hardened. Suspicion actually becomes a civic virtue. You think the Stasi or the Czechists or the KGB had where do you think they learned this? They learned all how to turn families on themselves. Enemies were no longer just wrong. Now they were seen as traitors to liberty. And this is the moment where the American debate begins to turn. For Jefferson and his followers, the French Revolution still represents the struggle against tyranny. Yes, it's violent. Yes, it's unstable. But they believed that the cause remained just. And they feared that criticism of France was really nostalgia for a monarchy in disguise. For the other side, a guy by the name of Alexander Hamilton and his allies, the revolution in France was becoming something far more dangerous. They didn't see liberty, they saw disorder. Not republican government, but mob democratic power. Not reform, but ideology armed with a guillotine. George Washington watched all of this with deep caution. He was grateful to France. He loved Lafayette, but he also understood something that many partisans forget. A republic must survive in the real world, not merely in speeches. The United States was still very young, weak, indebted, militarily vulnerable, and politically fragile. If we allowed French enthusiasm to drag us into the European war, our revolution might be destroyed by this. And that's the central dilemma. France had become our ally. Lafayette was our hero. The language being used was familiar to us. But the events looked increasingly unlike Philadelphia in 1776 and more like something Americans had not imagined but in fact feared. And that was the warning. It forced Americans to confront that question, more difficult than whether or not monarchy was bad. We already decided that one. The harder question is this. Once a people overthrow an old order, what restrains the new one? We had found that answer in 1776, particularly in May, and in our Constitution of 1789. The French never did. And that difference would split American politics wide open.
And I'm not so sure that was a good thing. We're going to discover more about it. And we let you talk to Dave Bowman in our final segment of a Tuesday morning, 321-768-1240. Of course, you miss anything, our podcast at BillMick.com, and on the show page, links to more of Dave's work.
If you think the founders were polite, you haven't been listening. This is Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
O'Galley Electric bringing you the hour, and once Dave wraps things up, we'll let you jump in with him at 321-768-1240 to wrap up our day here on WMMB. So, Dave, not so much for the Americans anymore. It's not about France. It's how we are perceiving it and how we're dividing over it. And you say that's leading to political parties, huh?
It really does. Spent 20 minutes talking about France, but it's really not about France. It's really about us, and it's about our own revolution. The Bastille falls in Paris this day. They celebrate it still. But the aftershocks are felt in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Charleston, Richmond. By the time the French Revolution is only a few years old, Americans are arguing with one another more bitterly than they had ever argued about the British during the final years before independence. It sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not. The French Revolution doesn't just influence American politics. It actually leads to the creation of the first truly national political divide in American history. Now, historians will tell you that the political parties formed because Alexander Hamilton proposed the national bank or because he wanted the federal government to assume state debts and that sort of thing. And those things mattered and they deserve their place in the story. But those debates may have remained ordinary disagreements among men who had fought a revolution together. But France changed everything. Before 1789, Washington's administration contained rival personalities. Their views on economics differed. Hamilton and Jefferson hated each other. They did not like each other. Their visions of the Constitution, interpretation differed. The Hamiltonian model versus the Jeffersonian model. But they still served together in the same cabinet, still serving the same national goals. But the French Revolution turns those disagreements into opposing worldviews. And almost every every political question becomes tied to events across the Atlantic. Bill, were you for France or were you against France? Sounds like a ridiculous question today because we think of foreign policy as separate from domestic politics.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1789, that wasn't the case. Our very existence was caused by the French military intervention. Thousands of French soldiers had fought alongside us and stayed. French fleets had made many French people stayed, much like the Hessians. French loans had kept us alive. Many people believed in America that we owed them a debt of honor, a permanent debt of honor. And then in 1793, things went in the tank. By this point, the French Revolution is out of control, the days of terror, as you know. We're not going to go into all that. But France, in its insanity, starts a world war. They declare war on most of Europe against Britain, Spain, Austria, and suddenly the United States has to make a decision. We're allied with France. But this war is insane.
Yeah, if you're allied with somebody, does that mean you have to be stupid when they are?
Well, 1914 would teach us yes. You do.
Okay.
Fortunately, George Washington did not hesitate. He immediately issued a neutrality proclamation. Sounds routine today, but at the time it was explosive. Washington, though, understood something that many of us did not. We were in no condition to fight a war. We had no navy to speak of. Our army was titled. Finances were still very fragile. Government was only 4 years old under the Constitution. Another major war could have destroyed us before we even learned how to govern ourselves. Washington believed neutrality was the only reasonable course, and of course, not everyone agreed, including the French government, who sent a new ambassador to America. And this guy, whose name was Edmund Charles Guéné, history recalls him as Citizen Guéné, arrived in America. He was welcomed warmly. Crowds cheered him. Americans held banquets. They wore French revolutionary cockades in their hats. It looked less like the arrival of a low-functioning diplomat, more like the arrival of a conquering hero. And then this guy, Citizen Genet, made one of the greatest diplomatic blunders in American history. He decided he didn't need to talk to George Washington or anybody in the government. Instead of working through that, he went directly to the American people, commissioning privateers in American ports to attack British shipping. American ships paid by this French guy to attack British shipping. He encouraged Americans to enlist in the French army. And he openly criticized Washington's neutrality policy. A foreign ambassador was attempting to organize American citizens against the stated policy of the President of the United States. Washington...
Did he become mayor of New York?
Maybe.
Just asking.
Washington was furious, Hamilton was outraged, and Jefferson was trapped. He admired the French Revolution, he wanted good relationships with France, but he understood that no foreign ambassador could be allowed to dictate American policy. And eventually, the administration demanded that France recall Genet back to France. And by the time the French government agreed and recalled him, the revolution had become so radical and dangerous that Genet was afraid to go home. He asked for political asylum, and we granted it. We said, this man who came to export the French Revolution to us ended up needing to be protected from it. The question divided the nation, and Hamilton believed that America's first duty was to preserve the Republic. Jefferson believed that the cause of liberty extended beyond natural borders. Both are ideas that come directly from the Declaration of Independence. But neither of those two men considered themselves to be anti-American. Each believed in, understood, each believed that the other was misapplying the revolution, and the disagreement became deeply personal. Hamilton admired a government that was energetic, strong public credit, stable currency. Jefferson, of course, had different ideas. He feared concentrated power more than public passion. The criticism of the French Revolution would grow, and the problem was, of course, Washington isn't going to be president forever. And eventually, these two ideas, driven bitterly by the French Revolution and these ideas of whether America should be this or that, would lead to the formation of the first two political parties, at least in part. And those two political parties, the Federalists and the Democrat Republicans, would battle over the presidency and Congress and the courts for the next probably 20 years, including the incredibly visceral election of 1800. Including, by the way, 11 years from today, July 14th, 1789, on July 14th, 1798, John Adams, a ardent Federalist, will sign a new law that the American Federalists have passed called the Alien and Sedition Act, which is still on the books today, by the way, and still dividing Americans over those same issues, whether or not we support France or the French ideals, or whether or not you support our government and our ideals. The same arguments that we had then are the same arguments we're having now. And it's what's led to visceral disagreements throughout our history. Hamilton was disliked by Jefferson. Jefferson was disliked by Hamilton. Both of them served America. Both of them served our revolution. Both of them served brilliantly. In the end, though, they could not overcome those passions. And they would lead to some of the most divisive arguments in American history, many of which can be traced back to this day in 1789, when the French stormed the Bastille.
Line 2, you're up on Bill Mick Live. Good morning.
Good morning. This is William Melbourne.
Yeah, go ahead, William.
Question for Dave. Did the Americans learn anything from what France did? Have we learned anything at all?
I like the question, William. Dave, go ahead.
Well, that's a good one there. I mean, the obvious answer is yes. We learned that political violence and excess this goes back to the May 10th results. Remember, we talked about John Adams talking about the fact that we needed to have a plan before we declared independence. You can't just overthrow things and then now what? What happens next? And this is what happened in France. They had no plan. They declared these rights, and then this revolutionary government started doing things like changing the calendar. I'm not kidding, folks. We don't have time to go through it all. You should go look at some of the things that the revolutionary government in France tried to do. They changed the week. It wasn't 7-day weeks anymore. And they were just confusing everybody because there was no control. There was no plan for how they were going to do this. So do I think we learned from the French? I think what we learned from the French is that we did it right. And this is what happens when you don't do it right. And it's sad because the French Revolution could have been massively impactful had it gone the course that we had gone. But because it went to the violent course, you ended up not with a revolution. You ended up with the French Empire. You ended up with Napoleon, followed by the reestablishment of the monarchy. So you never really got the constitutional republic that France wanted to have. And so you didn't send the message to the rest of the monarchies in Europe that, look, liberty rocks. Which, can you imagine a world where France, some of the German states, Holland, Russia, Sweden become more like American republics? By the time 1914 rolls around, it's a different world.
That it is. And Line 1 wanted to get you on, just don't have the time because our day is done. Dave Bowman, another great edition of Dave Does History, and I appreciate it. We'll talk to you next Tuesday, sir.
See you then.
Check out more stories from history at davedoeshistory.org.